Hello and welcome back. So today I'm in the creative mode sandbox, and this is still in version 0.15. I've had a few games now and gone all the way through to the end on most of them, and so obviously I've had a few goes at setting up science. Usually what happens for me is that I think quite carefully about the earlier sciences, and then as I go through it becomes more and more rushed and there's less and less design, more and more throwing things together. What I thought I would do is have a go in the sandbox at designing something at a leisurely pace, which I actually liked. So the design principles here were fairly simple. I wanted a clean belt bus base along the bottom. I wanted the science to be feeding into a science bus, and each of the sciences is self-contained. The red and green share an output belt, but they're self-contained in terms of most of their materials. Everything else is completely self-contained. I was aiming for a stable 1000 plus a minute, and I wanted a design which I could start off building with yellow belts and level 2 fabs, and then as the research progressed, upgrade to level 3 fabs and red belt. I'm aware this design could be improved by using blue belt here and there, but I've kind of gone off the idea of using blue belt designs, particularly on games where I intend to use logistics bots. If you're not using logistics bots, then blue belt kind of makes sense, but if you are using logistics, then by the time you need the throughput of blue belts, you really should be moving things around with logistics, in my view. So this is my design. So let's zoom in a bit and take a look. Okay. So I labeled the inputs of the belts with a constant combinator. And that means I can blueprint this, place it down in a new world, and the combinator will tell me what's meant to be on the belt. So we have 4 belts of iron, 2 belts of copper, 1 of steel, half of brick, 2 of green circuits, 1 of red circuits, half of blue circuits. Then we have half of engines, half of electric engines, and half of batteries. Oh, and sorry, I forgot the half of coal. The other thing I decided on this was that wherever possible, I would dead end the belts when they were no longer used. So for example, as soon as coal has gone into military, that's the end of the coal belt. And then in general, as a rule of thumb, the further down the bus you are, the further on you continue. So I'm going to be peeling things off from the top. So let's have a walk through. So the first and most interesting area, of course, is the research pods. So the labs. Now the labs I have not got working here because this world is running with all the research already researched. But this design works fine for me. You can join labs together with inserters. I find if you join them more than 3 or 4 deep, then it doesn't feed all of them. The top one is dry quite a lot of the time. So you can go 2 or 3 deep, that's fine. So I've chosen to go 2 deep here. This is 8 by 2 and then mirrored, so that's 32 labs. That's going to be absolutely ample for most games. I've run 25 lab rigs before, so a 5x5 square. This should be absolutely fine for when you're researching all your tech. It's set up here to be easy to build incrementally, so the red-green just goes in on a central belt, no undergrounds. And that feeds into the left and to the right with a long arm inserter. And again, the speed on the long arm is absolutely fine. They're not pulling the potions off very frequently, so that there's no problem with using a long arm inserter. Later on, when you get the military science and the light blue, This is running on an underground belt. And the reason for this is that we do the double inserter trick here. So we've got an inserter that takes off the middle belt, and then there's one to the side of it which is pulling off the far belt. This allows you to feed off 3 belts, because here I've got later on for the last 2 sciences, a normal inserter taking off the nearest belt. So if I was doing this for real in a game, I would be putting in the red-green belt and then the red inserter to one line of 8. As soon as they were starting to, when you'd done the research speed and things, I'd be adding on this second row of 8 to give me 16. And by then I would probably have military science, so this row would go in. So then I'd have some blue inserters pulling off military. And then it's really once you get into the final stage of the normal game, where you're adding on the last 2 researches, the yellow and purple. Okay, so that's the research rig, and the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed I'm using this creative mode voider here. So obviously in the real game you would just cut this top 3x3 block off. Okay, so that's the research belt. As I say, I set this up to be incrementally buildable, so the skips here are probably, yeah, they're slightly too big for yellow belt, but there's nothing to stop you skipping to one earlier and then on for a yellow belt. And of course, by the time you've got to the blue belt, sorry, to the red belts, you're on this row, that's fine. The other thing, because I wanted the build to be easy, this is the vanilla no underground belt. That meant I needed to feed the final science belt to the other side of it. So I just plumb it here, that works fine. Okay, so we're sending in iron plates, 2 of copper, 1 of steel, half of brick, 2 of green, 1 of red, half of blue, half of coal, engines, electric engines, batteries. So let's just double check that the red and green science. So the red and green both need gears, and it turns out that by the time you've fed 2 gear machines worth of gears up a belt and the reds have taken what they need, you have what's left over that the underground and the slow inserters require. So it's kind of fortuitous. I found through a bit of experimentation that if you made the underground and the belts down at the bottom straight after the gears, they had a tendency to starve the red machines. Whereas if you make them at the far end, the red machines get all the gears they need. It's just one of these weird things where you have to get the ordering right. Although it apparently is consuming the same amount of materials, the order in which you let things have bites at cherries matters. So then we flow the undergrounds and the inserters down the other way, and the green machines eat those, and then we're inserting onto a common belt in the middle. That's our red-green belt. Again, I've put combinators down here, so this is labeling for me what the inputs are. So the input here is 1 copper, 1 green, copper, gears. Obviously the gear isn't an input, but I've labeled that gears are on that because otherwise I'd be tempted to put in 2 lines of iron. Did I just say copper? Iron and gears. And then I've labeled the output as the 2 science potions. Okay, the military. Now this was entertaining. I've built military in lots of different ways in the past, and typically I've ended up being starved of iron in one way or another. The military is very heavy in iron because the turrets consume something like 20 units of iron and also 20 units of cogs. I think, let's just double check. Sorry, yeah, it's 10 cogs, 20 iron plate, and each cog requires 2 each, so that's 20 units go on the cogs and 20 on the iron. That's 40. Now, that would be fine for a blue belt, but we really do not have blue belts at this stage in the game. This is one of these things where it's a stage of the game issue, right? So there's no point designing this with blue belts because we will not have researched blue belts yet. So the solution is to run in an extra line of iron. And by trial and error, I've found that it's really tricky to keep all of this going with just 1.5 lines of iron. So the ammo and the grenades can be built quite happily with a half line of iron. But if you feed the leftovers of this into the turret build, that's not enough extra iron to keep the turrets going. So that's just the way it is. You have to run in your 2 lines of iron. It doesn't completely consume these if we skip down on the bus. So it's not quite consuming 2 totally, but it's more than 1. 1 line of copper is fine. If you put in a half line of copper, the copper does actually run out. So you have to put in a full line. It's not using the full line. Similarly with the steel, you're putting in a half line of steel. There's no way to put in less than half a line. Anyway, it just pulls off what it needs. Often with these builds, I've done 1 of yellow and 2 of red ammo. I went for the 3. It's slightly overkill rather than being slightly underkill. And the beauty of that is then you've got plenty of ammo to collect in a box up the top. So I always use a filter inserter here to filter out grenades in one and ammo in another, and then you can do the same with the turrets. And this way of arranging things is actually quite neat because it lets you put all your boxes close together. Okay. On Death Worlds, obviously I have a dedicated ammo making area which is just churning out ammo, but for normal worlds I tend to find this is making enough ammo to survive. The other design choice I made, the first few times I tried to build this, I was putting gears on a belt, and I kept having machines starving, so the machines would get greedy early on, pull off all the iron for the gears, stick the gears on, then the turrets would eat all the gears. I don't know if it was something to do with the stat bonus on the inserter, but the gears just weren't getting up, so I ended up going for a direct insert. So there's 1 gear machine for 2 turrets, which is very slightly overkill. And then we have 2, 4, 6, 8 turrets, and I think you only need 7. So anyway, we're absolutely fine here. The fact that these keep going slightly red doesn't matter because we've got more than enough capacity here anyway. And it leaves you extra turrets, which even on full research speed, when the research hasn't backed up, you're going to be collecting the occasional turret up here, which is great. Okay, so I don't know about you, but my games, I always end up doing red, green, military, even when I'm not in military heavy worlds. It's just that by the time you've done red and green, you already can make all the things you need for military. After the military comes the light blue, the cyane one. Now this, for me, is always the most annoying build. I've done it various ways. The way that seems to work best is when you bus in the motors, so the engines, sorry. I've done lots of builds where I've made the engines in the area, in the research area, and I end up with 3 or 4 different engine making areas. So I end up with one here, I end up one around where the train is, I end up with another one that's making the electrics, and it all just gets a bit out of hand. So here I decided I was going to be putting the engines on the bus. So the big bus for the factory would be making some engines, putting them on the bus, then some of those would be taken off and put on again as electrics. You get the idea. Okay, so this ends up actually being quite a simple build. So the entertaining thing is to get the electric mining drills. And for them, you need 1.5 lines of iron. So the first one, the full line is going all the way up. So you only need half a line of greens, but there wasn't a leftover half line for me to play with, so I put in a full line. So then we're feeding in as much iron as we can into these gear machines, so they're pulling in with 4 inserters. Now, I've I tried various options here with two inserters, with one inserter per gear machine rather than two per gear machine. And through timings, it just doesn't quite keep up. So I end up needing two inserters per gear machine. So these blocks of 4. You only need one to empty the machine because it's turning 2 plates into 1 gear. By doing it like this, there's always plenty of space on the belt, so they seem to be able to spit out their gears without delay. Then the electric mining drills as well require plates. Now, if we just had this one double line of iron, there wouldn't be enough iron to keep the mining drills going. So you need this other half line of iron to make them work. I tried splitting the inserters into the gear machines, so 2 came from this side and 2 from this side. It drained this half line of iron so quickly that it actually ended up being worse than having them pulling off one side. So there you are. So this makes electric mining drills at an alarming rate. They are then fed in, so we have the mining drills belt and a split belt of red circuits and engines. Then you just need billions of these machines, right? So you need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you need 16 of these machines to keep up with the build rate. So it's easier to split them at 8, 8. They're consuming things very slowly, so there's really no issue with pulling material off both belts with red inserters. So then they insert onto this outer belt, which gets merged. Because they are on the outside of each one, this kind of splitting just works fine. So then this ends up going down onto the research bus. Now, remember, we did red and green together. So then we're doing our cyan, and that needs to merge in with the military research. So this little kink here just makes sure that the military stays on one side of the belt and this stays on the other. I haven't bothered to do a full split merge because these are only ever outputting onto the far side of the belt, so we're fine. Okay, so that's your light blue research. Then we've got the purples. So the main input to the purple is these electric mining drills. Sorry, these electric furnaces. So they're kind of an endgame solution to smelting. Earlier on, they're not really any benefit other than you don't have to feed them with coal. Later on, they're brilliant because you can feed them up with some productivity modules and then speed beacon them. And that's a really, really big win. So anyway, at this point in the game, you'd probably still be running your coal-fed steel furnaces. These things require steel, brick, and red circuits. Now, they actually require very little red circuit, so the double lane of reds is completely overkill. They require not quite half a belt of steel and not quite half a belt of brick, so it works to do a split belt. So that all gets fed in. It's very important that the split belt be the inner one, because if it's the outer one, the red inserters cannot keep up pulling things off it. There are actually a few corners to the builds where I had to make sure that the right belts were close so that they were with the fast inserters. So here we are. So they're making your furnaces. They get dumped on the far side of the belt. The near side of the belt is electric engines, and electric engines are ones which are built using lube and the bog standard engines. So we then go into 12 purple science makers. In version 15 you also had to feed them tier 1 fabs. I have botched this by just having a source of fabs. in version 0.16, you do not need to feed it fabs as well. So I'm going to clean up this blueprint in 16, strip off that outer lane. I've not bothered to put in the machinery to make these because I'm not going to be making these. Okay, and then at the end, a filter inserter to provide electric furnaces. And you can see it's building up a reserve of these things. You'd probably want to limit those chests, but you know, you get the idea. So there we are. Then the final science is the gold. This is the annoying one. It requires blue circuits and batteries, which I bring on a split belt. Not very many of them, but you know, they're both annoying things to make. And then it requires tier 1 speed modules. Now it requires about 11 tier 1 speed module machines for 12 gold science machines. So there are slightly fewer tier 1 speed machines needed versus the gold science. So it works out the direct inserting, occasionally these are backed up a little bit, that's fine. And then similarly, you need slightly less than half copper cable for each of the gold. So I've got a single copper cable machine feeding into 2 gold science. And again, that works. Very occasionally the timing of the 2 inserters goes off and one of these runs a bit low on cables, but it's never for more than a fraction of a second. And these things take so long to build anyway that it doesn't make any difference. So that's the gold science. And then the gold science, so we're using a split belt of green and red. Now this is the end of our bus. So we're not making anything else here. So I'm just doing the simple splitting down the bottom. So then the gold science fits in. So if you remember the purple science, we were making things in 2 feeder lanes. So we end up with purple science on both sides of this belt. So to guarantee that things are nicely spread across a belt, we have to do the full lane merge here. But that works fine. That's working absolutely fine. Okay, so there's a couple of things to look at in the bus itself. So we start off with 4 lanes of iron plates. We use part of half a line for the red and green science. And then we use part of half a line for military science, for the grenades and the ammo. So it turns out that this is very nearly half. So that by the time you've finished here, if you were to do a split in underground, you'd get the occasional plate, and it's just more annoying than it's worth to try and merge that in. So I didn't, I've just dead-ended that. I'm assuming that this 4 lane of iron would be fed somewhere from a balancer upstream, and that balancer would be taking care of any overflow for me. Okay, so that's the end of that iron track. Then we need a full iron track going into the turrets. Now, it looks kind of backwards here, but you actually really do need the full line on the inside, not on the outside. And the simplest way to wire this is to actually take lane 3 and then to loop lane 2 around. So then lane 2, it doesn't consume the whole of lane 2. It's more of a topping up than a using it. Then we feed a dedicated line of iron. You can see this is moving pretty much, yeah, that's moving at a full line speed, right? It's got the occasional stutter. So we fill a full line of iron in to the mining drills, and then the overflow from our top up of the turrets goes in to the other side of mining drills. And you can see again, this is working at slightly over half a belt capacity, right? So it's consuming slightly over half a belt here. So we're using slightly over 1.5. Yeah. So that's fine. That all seems to work. So that's the end of iron. There's no other items down here that use iron, so that's the end of the iron. If you notice, I've used the hazard concrete. The hazard's all pointing in the same direction because this is all one block of inputs. Right, copper. That one is fairly straightforward. We bring in a split copper green circuit here. It only uses a trickle of copper, so we continue that line of copper on. Then there is a dedicated line of copper that's going into the turrets. Now, the turrets use 20 copper a second, I think. That's almost a full red belt, not quite. It's more than half a red belt. So it works out that, again, rather than splitting and merging, it's easier to just dead end this line at that point. So that allows this to back up. There you are. So then we carry on the other copper line, and then that goes all the way down to the far end where it gets turned into copper cables. Now, this uses up more than half a line of copper. So you can't get away with one line of copper for the whole thing. You need slightly over one line, 1 1/4, 1 1/2, something like that. So it's easiest to run 2 lines in. And again, this would be coming in from some sort of balancer upstream, so you're fine. Right, you can probably see on the hazard concrete now, the copper, we had 2 lines of copper, and the hazards are in the same direction. The next line is steel. I've flipped the direction of the hazard because it's a nice visual cue that it is something else. And then the bricks are below, and so I've flipped the direction again. So steel, we need a half line of steel and bricks going in here. And again, that's not quite half. You can see that it stalls. So it's nearly half, but not quite. And then if we scoot back up this way, we need some steel for our piercing rounds. And that's not even a fraction of a half, right? That's a trickle. So we pull off a little bit here, most of one here. So we're using about 3/4 of a lane of steel. That's fine. So that's the end of our steel story because there's no other use, so we just dead end that. Bricks are only used here, and you can see the copper gets used earlier, so that's at the top. Then both of these get completed, so we complete those. Green circuits. So there's a fraction of a half of a lane, if that, about 5 a second or something, get used by this single lonely slow inserter machine. Fine. So we just carry on this lane, don't even bother balancing, and then we feed the whole of this lane in here to the mining drills. And the 4 mining drills use almost 1/2, well, maybe 1/4, I don't know. They're by no means using an entire lane of green circuits. Then the second belt of green circuit are going in here. And these are being turned into modules. So it's green plus red makes a module. I tried using just 1 lane of green and balancing across using a splitter. Although on paper it was enough green, it in practice didn't seem to work out that way. So rather annoyingly, I think we have to have 2 lanes of green circuit on the bus. So yeah, on paper, I thought the calculations said that we could get away with a single lane of green. I've found that in practice you can't. Okay, so the reds are being used for the mining drills. They're being fed directly into the light blues, and they're being used. Sorry, mining drills. Why did I say mining drills? The reds are being used directly fed into the light blues, and they're being used for the electric furnaces. And then a half line is being used for the modules. It's using more than half of a lane, so you need a full lane of red. The blues, it's only pulling in a half lane. There's nothing else that uses it other than the yellow science. You can't put in less than a half lane of blue, so there you are. It was tempting to do something really fancy and make a sushi belt of blue and batteries, but in the past, when I've tried things like that, it's been doomed to failure, where from timing issues, you end up with machines pulling out all the blues and then all the batteries, and you end up with belts with blocks of blues where machines are starved for batteries. So yeah. Coal. So this is a boring one. Half a lane of coal gets pulled in for making grenades, and it's just a half belt. There's nothing I can put on the other half of that belt. Then we've got the standard engines to be merged in with the reds, and the electric engines which go on the opposite side of the belt from the furnaces. And the batteries, they're the ones that get merged in with the blue circuit. So that's it, that's the end of our bus. So it starts off quite full. And then as you go along, lines get pulled off, lanes get pulled off, entire materials get pulled off until there is nothing left. So I'm quite pleased with that. I've stuck with the 4 wide materials with the 4 underground. By the time you're this end, it doesn't make it, you could be using 6s. But to be honest, because the iron plates is the thing you need the most of, and that really only needs 4 for it to skip over, I went with 4, 4. So it ends up being 4, 4, 4, 4, which, is kind of neat and tidy, isn't it? The other things I did for keeping me sane is I added brick walkways. The idea is you have a 2 wide brick separating each lane, and it's just so that when you're early in the game and you haven't actually got things laid out, these brick are a very strong visual guide that when you're doing undergrounds and things, that this is the target area for undergrounding. I'm dyslexic, I'm terrible at doing lines, so anything like this which provides me with a guide, I'm all for. Then the lanes themselves are hazard concrete, and I flip the direction whenever you flip the material. Then I have concreted in a roadway with the drone ports on. The whole thing is in a drone port grid because, everybody needs logistics. And it just perfectly works out that the edge of the logistics area is the edge of the science build. Look at that. Nicely, beautifully lined up. And also, because of the heights of these things and an accident of how things got laid out, we've got our perfect rectangular grid of drone ports. And they exactly sit between all the machines. So there was a little bit of juggling things sideways. You can see there's a slightly larger than normal gap between the green science and military science here. But everything lines up. So apart from, I don't think there's much else to say. The only other thing to say is, although this is entirely belt fed, because things feed in and then disappear off, it would actually work quite well to feed this from train stations. So you can imagine having a series of train stations underneath. So you would bring in your iron trains here. Sorry, this was one I was building earlier before I got my main bus done. Let's just get rid of that. Yay! So you can imagine bringing in an iron train over this side, and then your copper train here. And as long as you brought your copper train in before this rover port, you can dump your copper onto the bus before it's needed. So the iron train would come in over this side, copper. Then your steel train, you've got a lot of space to fit in a steel and a coal train. So coal, steel. Then you've got a circuit train needed, a green circuit train, red circuits, and I don't know if you would want to make them here or bust them in, but you can bring in your engines, and then blue and batteries. I tend to find if I'm doing a heavily outpost-based build that blue and batteries get built at the same outpost, so you might even bring in a train with a carriage of blue and a carriage of batteries. So it's pretty much the right shape so that this could be stacked on top of a train station, and the train station could feed in all the materials. So just to prove we do have throughput, let's put 10 minutes. So the 10-minute throughput, we are consistently making between 1.1 and 1.2 of the potions, which is brilliant because as and when we launch rockets, if we're launching 1 rocket a second, that is 1,000 rocket science a second. So this will consume your rocket potions. You'd need to remodel the research area for that to put in the 7th line of potions, but you know, I'll leave that as an exercise to the user. Anyway, so this is it. This is an entirely belt-based research for getting your game started before you start to think about transitioning to an entirely bot-based megabase. Thank you very much for watching. I enjoy these little sandbox builds. My next world, I will probably be using this design in the world. So we'll see if it really works in a real 16 map. Happy Boxing Day and have a great rest of holiday.